Welcome to another deep dive this
Yeah.
time.
Huh?
We're really going deep into this conversation about AI and open source.
Okay.
We've got this fascinating dialogue between Michael Kessler, a tech CEO,
Right.
and Sina Moghimi, who's his CTO.
I see.
And what's really interesting is that the source material we have doesn't even mention their company by name.
Interesting.
So that adds a whole other layer to this.
A little mystery.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, they kind of jump right into it talking about guardrails for AI.
Okay.
That's Kessler's term.
Okay.
He sees them as like essential, whether it's through government regulation or,
Right.
companies doing it themselves.
It's like setting those boundaries.
Yeah.
But as Moghimi kind of points out,
Yeah.
AI, it can be unpredictable.
Uh-huh.
You can't always foresee every single outcome.
It's a wild card.
Yeah,
So, how do you even begin to design those guardrails?
right. And that leads to the question of, can regulations ever really keep up with
That's what Moghimi says.
a technology that's evolving so rapidly?
Yeah, he thinks historically a lot of regulations have come after,
Oh, I see.
after a failure.
That's just something's gone wrong.
Yeah, so it's reactive.
Okay.
But Kessler's counter to that is that we can't really afford to wait for AI to fail
Right.
because the consequences could be too great.
Too big.
Exactly. And they actually
Yeah.
use the example of Tesla self-driving cars,
Oh, right.
which we all know have had those high-profile accidents.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, who is actually responsible
Right.
when the AI makes a mistake?
Is it the driver? Is it the company that built the car?
Right. Is it the AI itself?
Right.
And Kessler really believes someone needs to be held accountable.
He does.
He sees government intervention as being key to that.
Okay.
But Moghimi, on the other hand, he's a little hesitant
Oh, really?
to place blame.
Hmm.
He thinks some failure is kind of
Intricate.
inevitable.
Okay.
With any new technology, it's a part of the learning process.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, it's kind of like, expecting a toddler to be perfect when they're first learning to walk. They're going to stumble.
Uh-huh.
But how much stumbling is really acceptable?
Right.
When we're talking about AI that can do things like drive cars or,
Medical diagnoses.
medical diagnoses, right? Or
Weapon systems.
yeah, exactly.
That's where Kessler brings in the idea of open source as a possible solution.
Oh, okay.
He argues that because it's transparent and collaborative,
Uh-huh.
it might be safer than just leaving AI development to a few powerful corporations.
But wouldn't that,
Right.
I mean, if it's more transparent,
Uh-huh.
wouldn't that make it easier to bake bias into the systems?
Yeah.
How do we account for that?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Moghimi admits that ensuring quality control and preventing bias in an open source environment,
Yeah.
that has its own challenges.
Okay.
But he sees potential in that you'd have this global community
Okay.
of developers, and they'd be able to more effectively identify and address those issues.
So it's like crowdsourcing
Yeah,
the ethics of AI development?
exactly.
That's interesting.
And he thinks the benefits
Okay.
extend beyond just catching errors.
Uh-huh.
He thinks open source creates this collaborative spirit
I see.
where people can build upon each other's work,
Okay.
and that's going to accelerate innovation.
Makes sense.
But then he makes this interesting comparison.
Oh,
He compares it to renewable energy.
okay.
He says it's great in principle,
Uh-huh.
but it's often less efficient
I see.
than what he calls the petroleum of closed source development,
Okay.
and uses the example of this company, DeepSec.
Oh, DeepSec.
Yep.
That's right.
I've heard of that.
They've been getting a lot of traction,
Right.
and people are choosing it because it's cheaper and more powerful,
Okay.
even though it's closed.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And some might have concerns about,
Yeah, but the company itself.
yeah, exactly.
So
It's-
DeepSec,
keeps coming up,
yeah.
but we don't really know a lot about them yet.
We don't.
Do we?
Right.
What makes them so appealing? What makes them so different?
Right.
But I guess for now, his point is
Yeah.
open source hasn't quite hit that level
Not yet.
of efficiency and wide adoption that you see with closed systems.
Right, and that contrast becomes even more apparent when he brings up Devland AI.
Devland AI.
Uh-huh.
Okay, that's new to me.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. How does it actually work?
Okay, so it sounds like a platform specifically to support open source development,
I see.
particularly in the field of robotics simulations.
Okay.
And he contrasts this with companies like SpaceX
Yeah.
that operate very secretly.
a closed-off environment.
Yeah.
So instead of just a small group of people working on something in isolation, you have a global community of developers contributing
A whole community.
to a shared pool of knowledge and resources.
Right. It's the difference between a walled garden and a sprawling park.
Yeah, exactly.
He sees Devlin AI as like a bridge between
I see.
cutting-edge research and public contribution.
Okay.
So it's democratizing access to AI education.
That sounds pretty ambitious.
It does.
But how does all of this
Yeah.
utopian vision of open source collaboration,
Right.
how does that actually work with the legal landscape?
Good question.
I mean,
And Kessler actually brings up a case that highlights the potential legal issues with AI.
oh, okay.
EEOC versus Kaplan.
Oh, wasn't that the case where an algorithm was used to screen job applicants?
That's the one.
And it ended up being discriminatory.
It was a landmark case
Yeah.
that really showed the dangers of algorithmic bias.
So where does open source fit into all of this?
Right.
Wouldn't it, with all the transparency,
Uh-huh.
wouldn't it actually be easier to bake bias into the systems?
Yeah.
How do we account for that?
Well, that's the paradox, isn't it? You've got the transparency, but that doesn't automatically mean there's no bias.
Right.
Kessler argues that with all that community scrutiny and the different perspectives you get with open source, that might actually be the best way to identify and mitigate the bias.
So it's like having more people look at the code, more people raising questions
More sets of eyes.
from different backgrounds and pointing out potential issues.
But Kessler brings up another concern, too.
Okay.
He's worried about the big tech companies,
Yeah.
dominating the AI landscape.
But how can they dominate if it's open source?
Well, they've got massive resources,
Yeah.
huge research teams, tons of data.
That's true.
They can afford to open source these projects
Mm.
that might not be commercially viable for smaller companies.
Right.
And when they do that, they kind of set the agenda.
I see.
They influence the standards and
Right.
could even squeeze out competitors.
He uses the example of Meta open sourcing Llama, right?
Yeah.
But wasn't that seen as a good thing for the open source community?
It was. It definitely had its benefits.
Right.
But Kessler's point is that it's also a way for big tech companies to kind of
Oh, I see.
exert their influence
Yeah.
and make sure AI development goes in a direction that's advantageous for them.
So it's like a Trojan horse?
Yeah, you could see it that way.
It's a gift, but with strings attached.
Moghimi knows these power dynamics exist,
Oh, okay.
but he also says we need balance. We need to find ways to regulate AI,
Right.
but without stopping innovation.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, it's tricky.
It's like, how do you encourage progress without letting things get out of control?
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? What's the path forward?
They both seem to agree that public education about AI is essential.
So we need to make AI less mysterious.
Demystify it.
Yeah, and help people understand what it all means.
Yeah, the implications.
Both the good and the bad.
Right, because Moghimi believes that when it comes to AI, knowledge is power.
Okay.
The more people understand,
Yeah.
the better equipped they are to talk about it,
Right. To have those important conversations.
about how AI is developed and how it's used.
How do you even begin to educate the public about something that's constantly changing so rapidly?
Yeah, that's the challenge.
It's such a complex field.
It really is, and it's something they both struggle with.
Right.
Kessler thinks a grassroots movement is the way to go,
I
to
see.
challenge big tech's influence,
Okay.
while Moghimi is more in favor of working together
Okay.
and using the resources and expertise of those companies to support open source projects.
So they're coming at it from different angles.
Yeah.
But they both agree that public engagement is key.
Absolutely. And Moghimi brings up this really interesting idea,
What's that?
federated learning.
Okay, I've heard that term,
Yeah.
but I don't really get it.
So instead of having all the data in one giant data center,
Right.
imagine it spread out across a bunch of devices.
Okay.
Your smartphone, your computer, even sensors in your car.
I see.
Each one contributes to the learning process without actually sharing its raw data.
So you're pooling all that computing power, but without
Right.
creating these giant targets for hackers.
Exactly. And this is interesting for privacy and security, of course. But it also means more people have access to AI training.
Right.
And potentially it could reduce the dominance of those huge tech companies.
That's a good point.
It's a pretty compelling argument for federated learning.
Yeah, it sounds like a way to give individuals more power when it comes to AI development.
Right.
But it must be tricky coordinating all those devices and
It's definitely complex.
making sure the data is good.
And Kessler asks this really important question.
Okay.
If we move away from corporate-funded AI,
Yeah.
who's going to take care of these big open source projects?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to make sure it's secure? Who sets the standards?
And Moghimi's answer is kind of a leap of faith.
Okay.
He thinks it's up to individuals, governments,
Uh-huh.
and the community of people who really care about open source.
It's like he's calling everyone to action.
Yeah.
We can't just hope for the best. We need to get involved.
We need to actually participate, contribute, and advocate for it. And they end their conversation sort of unsure about the future of open source.
Okay.
Especially with the impact DeepSec is having.
DeepSec again.
Yeah. It's a reminder that things in the AI world are changing all the time.
Right.
And what looks like a sure thing today could be gone tomorrow.
Okay, but we've been talking around DeepSec this whole time.
We have.
And we know it's popular, we know it's closed, and we know it's shaking things up.
Uh-huh.
But what is it about DeepSec that's so attractive?
That's the thing.
What are they doing that no one else is?
The source material doesn't go into detail about their technology or how they do business.
Really?
We just see glimpses of its impact.
It's almost like...
Which makes it even more interesting.
It's like the shadow hanging over the whole conversation.
Right.
We keep hearing about this mysterious force, but we never get a clear picture.
It's kind of frustrating, but also brilliant.
Yeah, it leaves us wanting more.
It does.
Yeah, it really does make you think.
Uh-huh.
I mean, this whole DeepSec thing,
Yeah.
it feels like such a big part of this.
A missing piece.
Yeah, and yet we don't really know anything about it.
We don't.
Maybe that's a sign, though.
What do you mean?
Well, maybe it's success, even though it's so secretive.
Right.
Maybe that tells us something about where the AI industry is right now.
Interesting.
Like maybe people are choosing convenience and efficiency over transparency.
At least for the time being.
Yeah, I know.
Makes you wonder.
It does.
What are we willing to give up?
Yeah, what are we willing to compromise?
What really matters to us when it comes to AI?
Right.
That's something to think about as we go over the key takeaways from this discussion.
Okay, so much to unpack here.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that we need to be careful about how we develop AI.
Right.
Think about those guardrails Kessler was talking about.
Yeah.
It's not just about the code itself.
It's bigger than that.
It's the laws, the public awareness,
Uh-huh.
and being willing to have those tough conversations.
Right. Being accountable, taking responsibility. And we can't forget about open source either.
No, definitely not.
I mean, they both seem to agree
Yeah.
that it could lead to a more transparent and fair AI landscape.
More equitable,
Yeah.
but it's not a perfect solution.
Right.
Open source has its own issues, like how to fund it,
Yeah, how to make sure it's good quality
quality control,
and how to prevent it from being misused.
right? All important considerations.
And even if we figure all that out,
Yeah.
how do we make sure open source can keep up with these closed systems?
Like DeepSec.
Yeah, like DeepSec, that are so efficient and have so many resources behind them.
It's a real David and Goliath situation.
It is. And it's hard to say who's going to win.
It is.
And this is why public education is so crucial.
Absolutely.
If we want AI to benefit everyone, we
Yeah.
can't just leave it to the experts.
We can't.
We need to understand it ourselves.
Understand how it works.
Yeah. What are the risks? What are the good things that can come out of it?
The potential.
Yeah. And how can we be a part of the conversation?
How can we contribute?
Right. We can't just sit back and be passive.
We need to be informed,
Exactly.
active participants.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we have one final thought for you.
Huh?
AI is changing so quickly.
It is.
How are you going to help shape its future?
Good question.
Will you support open source?
Will
Will you speak out about AI ethics?
Will you learn more about how AI will impact your life?
The decisions we make right now.
They're going to shape the future.
It's up to all of us to make sure it's a future we want.
A future we can all be a part of.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.